The smell of old paper and lavender reached Ethan before he even opened the door, and somehow he knew that walking into his grandmother's house that afternoon would change everything he thought he understood about his family. The light through the windows fell wrong, too sharp, too cold, cutting across the furniture like it was searching for something hidden in the floorboards, and the air felt dense with the weight of years that had never been spoken aloud. He stood on the porch, holding a single envelope his mother had pressed into his hand that morning with trembling fingers, her eyes red, but her voice steady when she told him to read it alone, to read it here, in the house where it all began. The envelope was thin, almost weightless, but Ethan could feel the gravity of it pulling at his chest, could sense the way the world was about to tilt beneath him, could hear in the silence of that empty hallway the first whisper of a truth that had been buried for 30 years. Ethan had always thought of his grandmother's house as a place frozen in amber, a relic of a gentler time when Sunday dinners lasted for hours and the kitchen smelled perpetually of cinnamon and butter. But standing in the doorway now with that envelope burning a hole in his jacket pocket, he realized he had never truly seen this place at all. The hardwood floors creaked under his weight as he stepped inside, each groan of the wood a small accusation, and he closed the door behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo through every room, like a secret finally being locked into place. Dust motes swirled in the afternoon light, spinning lazily through the air as if they had all the time in the world, as if they hadn't been waiting decades for someone to finally disturb them. And Ethan moved through the living room with the careful steps of a man walking through a museum dedicated to his own life. The furniture was exactly as he remembered it from childhood. The same floral couch with its worn armrests, the same mahogany coffee table his grandfather had built by hand in 1962, the same photographs lining the mantelpiece in their silver frames, but everything felt different now, charged with an electricity he couldn't name. His grandmother had passed away 6 months ago, peacefully in her sleep at the age of 87, and the family had gathered for the funeral in the small chapel on Riverside Drive, where she had attended services every Sunday for 50 years. Ethan remembered standing beside his mother at the graveside, watching her face remain perfectly composed, even as tears rolled down her cheeks. And he remembered the way his Uncle David had gripped his shoulder afterward, telling him that Margaret had been a saint, that she had held this family together through storms Ethan was too young to remember. But his mother hadn't spoken much after the funeral, had retreated into a kind of quiet that felt less like grief and more like guilt. And when the lawyer had called 3 weeks ago to say that Margaret's will was being read and that Ethan's presence was specifically requested, his mother had turned pale in a way that made his stomach twist with unease. She had tried to tell him not to go, had said something about old family business that didn't concern him, but Ethan had insisted because the lawyer had been clear that his grandmother had left something for him, something that couldn't be delivered through the mail, something that required him to be present in person. The will reading had been held in a stuffy office downtown, all dark wood and leather chairs, and the smell of old law books. And Ethan had sat between his mother and his Uncle David, while the lawyer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a voice like rustling paper, had gone through the usual provisions. The house would go to David, the oldest child, along with most of the furniture and family heirlooms. The savings account, modest but respectable, would be split between Margaret's 3 children. Various items of jewelry would go to her granddaughters. Everything had been straightforward, predictable, the kind of sensible distribution you'd expect from a woman who had lived her entire life by the rules. And then the lawyer had paused, had looked directly at Ethan with an expression that seemed almost apologetic, and had said that Margaret had left a specific instruction regarding her grandson. There was an envelope sealed and marked with Ethan's name, to be read alone in the house on Maple Street, the house where Margaret had raised her children, the house where all the family gatherings had taken place for as long as anyone could remember. The The lawyer had handed it to Ethan's mother, who had accepted it with hands that shook so badly she nearly dropped it, and the room had fallen into a silence so complete that Ethan could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. His uncle David had broken the silence first, asking what was in the envelope, but the lawyer had simply shaken his head and said that Margaret's instructions had been explicit and that the contents were for Ethan alone. David's face had darkened then, a flush of anger spreading across his cheeks, and he had started to protest, started to say something about family transparency and the importance of keeping everything in the open, but his mother had cut him off with a sharp look that Ethan had never seen her use before. They had left the office in strained silence, and when they reached the parking lot, David had pulled Ethan aside and told him in a low, tight voice that whatever was in that envelope, it was probably nothing. Probably just some sentimental nonsense from an old woman who had gotten confused in her final years. But Ethan's mother had pressed the envelope into his hands that morning with an urgency that suggested it was anything but nonsense, had told him to go to the house, to read it there, to do what his grandmother had asked. And when Ethan had looked into her eyes, he had seen something he had never seen before, a kind of desperate pleading that made him feel like he was standing on the edge of a cliff he hadn't known existed. So he had driven to Maple Street, had parked in front of the white-clappered house with its wraparound porch and its overgrown garden, and now here he was, standing in the living room of his childhood, holding an envelope that weighed almost nothing but felt like it contained the entire world. He pulled it from his pocket slowly, his fingers trembling slightly as they traced the edges of the paper, and he saw his name written in his grandmother's careful cursive across the front, the ink slightly faded, but still clear, still deliberate. Ethan sat down on the floral couch, feeling the familiar sag of the cushions beneath him, and he turned the envelope over in his hands, studying the wax seal on the back, the deep red color that looked almost like dried blood in the slanting afternoon light. He thought about his grandmother, about the woman who had taught him to play chess on rainy afternoons, who had baked him chocolate chip cookies every birthday, who had listened to all his childhood fears and dreams with the kind of patient attention that made him feel like the most important person in the world. And he thought about his mother, about the sadness that had always lived behind her eyes, the way she sometimes looked at family photographs with an expression that seemed like mourning, the way she had never quite fit into the family narrative the way his uncle David did, loud and confident and always at the center of every story. Ethan had always assumed it was just her personality, her natural quietness, her preference for the margins rather than the spotlight, but now he wondered if there had been something else, something deeper, something that had been carefully hidden beneath decades of Sunday dinners and birthday parties and Christmas mornings. The house was so quiet he could hear the clock ticking in the kitchen, could hear the soft whistle of wind through the crack in the window frame, could hear his own breathing getting faster as his thumb slipped under the edge of the envelope's seal. He hesitated for just a moment, some instinct warning him that once he opened this, once he read whatever his grandmother had felt compelled to leave for him, there would be no going back, no way to unknow what was about to be revealed. But the weight of his mother's eyes that morning, the way she had squeezed his hand before letting him go, the way his grandmother had written his name with such care across this paper, all of it pushed him forward. Ethan broke the seal, the wax crumbling under his fingers like dried petals, and he pulled out 2 sheets of paper, both covered in his grandmother's handwriting, the letters slightly shaky but still legible, still full of the same deliberate precision he remembered from birthday cards and grocery lists. The first line made his breath catch in his throat, made the room seem to tilt and blur around him, made everything he thought he knew about his family suddenly feel like a story someone had told him once that he had never thought to question. Before the story continues, share in the comments which country you are watching from, because every journey told here begins with someone just like you. And if stories like this speak to you, make sure to subscribe now, because each week a new truth rises to the surface, and I want you here for every revelation. The letter began with an apology, which somehow made everything worse, made the words that followed feel heavier and more inevitable, like watching storm clouds gather on a horizon you can't escape. Ethan read the first paragraph 3 times before his brain would accept what his eyes were seeing, before the meaning of the sentences could penetrate the shock that had settled over him like a fog. And even then, he had to set the pages down on the coffee table and stand up, had to walk to the window and look out at the street where children were riding bicycles and a neighbor was mowing his lawn, had to confirm that the ordinary world was still turning even as his own world was cracking apart. At the foundations, his grandmother's words were careful, measured, the tone of someone who had spent years choosing exactly how to say what needed to be said, and she started by telling him that she loved him, that she had always loved him, that nothing in this letter would change that fundamental truth. But then she wrote that there were things he needed to know, things that had been kept from him his entire life, things that she could no longer carry to her grave without giving him the choice of what to do with them. She wrote that his mother, Sarah, was not actually her biological daughter, that Sarah had been adopted when she was 3 days old, taken in by Margaret and her husband Robert in the spring of 1965 when the world was different and secrets were easier to keep. Ethan felt his legs weaken beneath him, and he returned to the couch, his hands shaking as he picked up the letter again, as he forced himself to keep reading, even though every instinct told him to stop, to burn the pages, to pretend he had never come here at all. His grandmother explained that the adoption had been closed, that Sarah's biological parents had been young and unable to care for a child, that Margaret and Robert had wanted a daughter desperately after having 2 sons, David and Thomas, and that the agency had arranged everything quickly and quietly, the way such things were done in those days. She wrote that they had never told Sarah the truth, had raised her as their own, had loved her as their own, had believed that keeping the secret was the kindest thing they could do. But then Margaret's handwriting became smaller, tighter, as if the words themselves were becoming harder to write, and she explained that there was more, that the adoption had not been as straightforward as they had believed, that years later, when Sarah was already grown and married with a child of her own, Margaret had discovered something that had haunted her ever since. She had been going through old papers in the attic, preparing to move to a smaller house after Robert's death, and she had found a folder tucked away in a box of his things, a folder containing documents that Robert had apparently kept hidden even from her, documents that told a very different story about Sarah's origins. The biological mother listed on the original adoption papers was named Elizabeth Cartwright, and according to the file, Elizabeth had not been some desperate teenager, but rather the mistress of a wealthy businessman named Harold Brennan, a man who owned half the commercial real estate in their county and whose family name was synonymous with money and power. Elizabeth had gotten pregnant, and Harold, who was married with 3 children of his own, had arranged for the baby to be given away, had paid for everything to be handled discreetly, had made sure there would be no paper trail connecting him to the child. Robert, it turned out, had known Harold through business connections, and the adoption had been arranged through private channels, with money changing hands and documents being carefully sanitized to remove any trace of the Brennan family involvement. Ethan set the letter down again, his mind reeling, trying to process what this meant, trying to understand why his grandmother was telling him this now, decades after it had all happened. He stood and walked through the house, moving from room to room, as if searching for something that would make sense of this information. And he found himself in his grandmother's bedroom, standing in front of her dresser, where a photograph of the whole family sat in a silver frame. It had been taken at Christmas 5 years ago. Everyone gathered around the tree, smiling for the camera, and Ethan studied his mother's face in the picture, the way she stood slightly apart from her brothers, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes. He returned to the living room and picked up the second page of the letter, and his grandmother's words became even more pointed, even more urgent. She wrote that Harold Brennan had died 10 years ago, and that his legitimate children, his 3 sons who had inherited his empire, had no idea that they had a half-sister, that Sarah existed at all. But Margaret wrote that she had been following the Brennan family over the years, reading about them in the newspaper, watching as they built on their father's fortune, and she had come to believe that Sarah had a right to know where she came from, had a right to claim her share of the inheritance that should have been hers, had a right to stand up and tell the truth about who she was. The letter explained that Margaret had kept all the documents Robert had hidden, had organized them into a folder that she was leaving for Ethan in a safe deposit box at First National Bank, and that the key to that box was taped to the back of the photograph on her bedroom dresser, the photograph of the whole family at Christmas. She wrote that she was giving this information to Ethan rather than directly to Sarah because she knew her daughter, knew that Sarah would be too afraid to do anything with it, too worried about causing conflict or disrupting the family, too conditioned by a lifetime of trying to fit in and not make waves. But Margaret believed that Ethan, young and strong and untainted by all the years of lies, might have the courage to help his mother claim what was rightfully hers. Ethan walked back to the bedroom, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat, and he picked up the silver frame, turning it over with trembling hands. There, taped to the back exactly as his grandmother had said, was a small brass key, and attached to the key was a tag with a number written in faded ink. He held it up to the light, this tiny piece of metal that apparently unlocked a truth big enough to reshape his entire family. And he thought about his mother, about all the times she had seemed sad for no reason, about all the times his Uncle David had made decisions for the family while she sat quietly by, about all the times he had seen her look at his grandmother with an expression he had never been able to read. The Brennan family, Ethan knew who they were even without having to look them up. Everyone in town knew the Brennans, the family that owned the tallest building downtown, the family that had their name on the hospital wing and the library and half the plaques in the city park. He thought about the 3 Brennan sons, all of them successful in their own right, all of them living in mansions on the hill, while his mother worked as a secretary at a legal firm and lived in a modest ranch house on the edge of town. He thought about the inheritance his Uncle David had just received from his grandmother's estate, the house and the furniture and the small savings account, and he thought about the vast fortune the Brennan family controlled, the millions of dollars that had been built on the back of a secret, on the erasure of an inconvenient child. The anger came slowly at first, then all at once, flooding through him like a wave breaking over rocks, and Ethan found himself gripping the key so hard it left an impression in his palm. His mother had been robbed, not just of money, but of identity, of history, of the truth about who she was and where she came from, and everyone had participated in the robbery, his grandparents by keeping the secret, his biological grandfather by paying to make her disappear, the adoption agency by sealing the records, even his Uncle David, who had always treated his mother like she was less than him, like she didn't quite belong in the same way he did. Ethan walked back to the living room one more time and read through both pages of the letter again, looking for something he might have missed, some explanation that would make this feel less like a betrayal and more like a difficult choice made with good intentions. But the more he read, the more he understood that his grandmother had been carrying guilt for years, had known that keeping this secret from Sarah was wrong, had probably wanted to tell her daughter the truth 1,000 times, but had never found the courage until it was too late to say it out loud. So she had written it down instead, had passed the burden to her grandson, had trusted that he would know what to do with it. The house was growing darker as the sun moved lower in the sky, shadows stretching across the floor and climbing the walls. And Ethan sat in the dimness, thinking about what came next, about how you tell your mother that everything she thought she knew about herself was a lie, about how you look your uncle in the eye when you know that his inheritance is legitimate, while hers was stolen before she was old enough to remember. He thought about the safe deposit box waiting at the bank, about the documents his grandfather had hidden away, about the proof that Sarah was a Brennan, that she had rights, that she had been erased from a fortune that should have included her. And he thought about the Brennan brothers, about the way powerful families protect their secrets, about the lawyers and the money and the influence they could bring to bear if someone tried to challenge their claim to their father's estate. Ethan was 28 years old, a high school teacher who lived paycheck to paycheck, and he had no idea how to fight men who owned buildings and had judges on speed dial. But as he sat in his grandmother's living room holding that brass key, he felt something hardening inside him, something that felt like resolve, or maybe just the refusal to let his mother go on, living in the shadow of a lie. He put the letter and the key in his pocket and stood up, moving through the house one last time, looking at all the ordinary objects that now felt like props in a play he hadn't known he was watching. The floral couch where his grandmother had read him stories, the kitchen where she had taught him to make pie crust, the bedroom where she had slept beside the man who had helped bury a secret so deep it had taken 30 years to surface. All of it looked different now, haunted by the weight of what had been hidden here, what had been protected here, what had been slowly poisoning his family from the inside out. When Ethan locked the front door behind him and walked to his car, the suburban streets still looked peaceful and normal, the neighbor still mowing his lawn, the children still riding their bikes, but he felt like he was moving through a different world now, a world where nothing was quite as stable as it appeared, where every family had cellars full of secrets and every inheritance came with a price no one wanted to name. He sat in the driver's seat for a long time before starting the engine, the key in his pocket, pressing against his leg, like a small, insistent reminder that some truths, once discovered, demanded action, demanded justice, demanded that someone finally stand up and say that what happened was wrong. Ethan drove home through streets that felt unfamiliar, even though he had traveled them 1,000 times, the evening light turning everything amber and strange. And when he pulled into his apartment complex, he sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes trying to figure out how to tell his mother what he had learned without shattering her completely. He knew she would be waiting for his call, knew she had probably spent the entire day pacing her kitchen and staring at her phone, and the thought of her anxiety made his chest tighten with a protective anger that surprised him with its intensity. His mother had always been the gentlest person he knew, the one who apologized when other people bumped into her, the one who never asked for anything, never demanded her share, never made a scene. And now he understood that her quietness had been shaped by a lifetime of not quite belonging, of sensing something was different without ever knowing what it was. He called her from the car, and she answered on the first ring, her voice tight with worry, asking if he had gone to the house, if he had read the letter, if he was okay. Ethan told her he was fine, told her he needed to see her in person, told her he would be there in 15 minutes, and she agreed in a whisper that sounded like defeat, like she had known this day was coming and had been dreading it for years. When he arrived at her house, the small ranch with its neat flower beds and its faded blue shutters, she was standing in the doorway waiting for him, and he saw immediately that she had been crying, her eyes red and swollen, her face pale in the porch light. They sat at her kitchen table, the same table where Ethan had done his homework as a child, where they had eaten countless dinners together after his father died, and he laid the letter on the surface between them, smoothing out the pages with hands that still trembled slightly from the shock of it all. His mother looked at the handwriting and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, but she didn't pick up the letter, didn't reach for it, just stared at it like it was something dangerous that might explode if touched. Ethan told her everything, told her what his grandmother had written, told her about the adoption and Elizabeth Cartwright and Harold Brennan, told her about the documents hidden in a safe deposit box and the inheritance that should have been hers. And with every word he spoke, he watched his mother's face collapse a little more, watched her shrink into herself as if she could disappear entirely if she just made herself small enough. When he finished, the silence in the kitchen was absolute, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere down the street. And his mother finally spoke in a voice so soft he had to lean forward to hear her. She said she had always known something was wrong, had always felt like she didn't quite fit, had always wondered why her brothers looked so much like their father while she looked like no one, had always sensed a distance between her and her parents that she couldn't name or bridge, no matter how hard she tried. She said there had been moments over the years when she had almost asked, times when she had caught her mother looking at her with an expression that seemed like guilt, but she had been too afraid of the answer, too afraid of confirming what she already suspected, that she was different, that she was other, that she was not fully theirs. Ethan reached across the table and took her hand, and he told her that none of that mattered now, that what mattered was the truth and what they were going to do with it, that she had rights, that she had been cheated, that the Brennan family owed her recognition and restitution. But his mother pulled her hand away and shook her head, and she said in a voice that was stronger now, almost fierce, that she didn't want anything from the Brennans, that she didn't want their money or their name, that she had lived her whole life as Sarah Mitchell, and that was who she was, not some forgotten daughter of a man who had paid to erase her before she was even old enough to know his face. The argument that followed was the first real fight they had ever had, Ethan insisting that this wasn't just about money, but about justice, about her father's responsibility, about the fact that 3 men had inherited a fortune that should have been divided 4 ways, while his mother insisted that digging up the past would only bring pain, would destroy what little peace she had managed to build, would open wounds that could never heal. She said that David and Thomas were her brothers, regardless of blood, that Margaret had been her mother in every way that mattered, that she didn't need the Brennans to validate her existence or make her whole. But Ethan could hear the hurt beneath her words, could see the way her hands shook as she spoke, could sense that part of her wanted what he was offering, even as another part recoiled from the thought of claiming it. He made a mistake then, made it out of love and frustration and the righteous anger that had been building in him since he first read his grandmother's letter. And he told his mother that he was going to the bank anyway, that he was going to get the documents, that he was going to find a lawyer who could help them build a case against the Brennan estate. His mother stood up so fast, her chair scraped against the floor with a sound like a scream, and she told him in a voice he had never heard her use before that he would do no such thing, that these were her secrets to keep or reveal, that he had no right to make decisions about her life without her permission. But Ethan had already made up his mind, had already decided that someone needed to fight for her, since she wouldn't fight for herself, and he told her that his grandmother had given him the key for a reason, had trusted him to do what was right, and that he wasn't going to let the Brennan family get away with what they had done just because his mother was too afraid to stand up to them. The words came out harsher than he intended, crueler, and he saw her flinch as if he had struck her, saw the way her face went blank and closed, and he knew immediately that he had crossed a line, had hurt her in a way that might not be easily repaired. She asked him to leave, her voice cold and steady now, empty of the warmth that usually filled every interaction between them, and Ethan stood up from the table, feeling the full weight of what he had done, the way he had taken her trauma and made it about his own need to fix things, to be the hero, to force a confrontation she didn't want. He tried to apologize, tried to take back the words, but she just shook her head and walked to the front door, holding it open and waiting for him to go. And when he passed her on his way out, he saw that she was crying again, silent tears streaming down her face, and she wouldn't meet his eyes. Ethan spent that night lying awake in his apartment, replaying the conversation over and over, feeling sick with regret, but also stubborn in his conviction that he was right, that his mother deserved more than she was willing to ask for, that someone needed to hold the Brennans accountable for what Harold had done. He kept thinking about the 3 brothers, imagining them in their expensive houses, living off money that should have been split 4 ways, never knowing that they had a sister, never having to reckon with their father's choices. The injustice of it burned in his chest like acid, made it impossible to sleep, made him feel like the whole world was tilted wrong and would stay that way until someone set it right. In the morning, against his mother's wishes and against his own better judgment, Ethan drove to First National Bank and presented the key his grandmother had left him. The bank employee, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, led him to the vault and opened the safe deposit box, and inside was a manila folder thick with papers, exactly as his grandmother had promised. Ethan took the folder to a private viewing room and spread the contents across the table, and for the next hour hour, he read through documents that told the complete story of his mother's origins, adoption papers with names that had been redacted and then restored, financial records showing payments from Harold Brennan to the adoption agency, even a letter in Harold's handwriting explaining that the child must never know, that Elizabeth Cartwright must never contact the adoptive family, that the entire matter must be sealed and forgotten. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable, and Ethan felt a grim satisfaction as he organized it all back into the folder, as he imagined presenting it to a lawyer, as he pictured the look on the Brennan brothers' faces when they realized their father had hidden a child, had denied her birthright, had built their fortune on a foundation of lies. He took the folder home and spent the weekend researching inheritance law, reading about cases where illegitimate children had successfully claimed portions of estates, learning about statutes of limitations and standards of proof, and the kinds of arguments that held up in court. On Monday morning, he called his Uncle David, ostensibly to ask about some details regarding his grandmother's house, but really to test the waters, to see if David knew anything about the adoption or the secrets his parents had kept. David was friendly enough on the phone, his usual booming voice filling the line with stories about his weekend and complaints about property taxes. And when Ethan carefully mentioned that he had found some old papers at the house, David brushed it off, said there was probably all kinds of junk in the attic, said he would deal with it when he got around to clearing the place out. There was no hint of awareness, no suggestion that David had any idea his sister wasn't his biological sibling, and Ethan felt a wave of disgust at his uncle's casual dismissal, his assumption that anything found in that house belonged to him to dispose of as he saw fit. Ethan made another mistake then, driven by the anger that had been simmering since his fight with his mother, and he called a lawyer whose advertisement he had seen online, a man who specialized in estate disputes and whose website promised aggressive representation for clients who had been denied their rightful inheritance. The lawyer, Richard Carmichael, agreed to meet with him that afternoon, and Ethan brought the folder to his office, a sleek space downtown with glass walls and modern furniture that screamed success and ambition. Carmichael went through the documents with the practiced eye of someone who had seen every kind of family secret, and when he finished reading, he leaned back in his chair and told Ethan that they had a case, that the evidence was solid, that the Brennan estate could be challenged, and that his mother stood a very good chance of winning a substantial settlement, if not an actual share of the inheritance. He said it would be expensive, that these kinds of cases took time and resources, but that he would be willing to work on contingency, taking a percentage of whatever they won rather than charging upfront fees. He said they should move quickly, should file papers before the Brennan family had time to shore up their defenses, should strike while the evidence was fresh and the element of surprise was on their side. Ethan felt the adrenaline rushing through him as Carmichael spoke, felt the satisfying sense of taking action, of finally doing something instead of just sitting with the injustice, and he told the lawyer to go ahead, to draw up whatever papers were needed to start the process of claiming what his mother was owed. Carmichael smiled, a sharp, predatory expression that should have warned Ethan that he was making a terrible mistake, and they shook hands, and Ethan signed a retainer agreement that gave the lawyer permission to proceed on his mother's behalf. It wasn't until he was driving home, the evening sun setting behind him and casting long shadows across the highway, that Ethan realized what he had done, how badly he had betrayed his mother's trust, how completely he had ignored her explicit wishes in favor of his own need to force a confrontation. He had just set in motion a legal battle that would expose her most private pain to public scrutiny, that would drag her into a fight with one of the most powerful families in the state, that would make her the center of attention in exactly the way she had spent her whole life trying to avoid. His phone rang and his mother's name appeared on the screen, and Ethan's stomach dropped because somehow he just knew that she had found out. That word had already gotten back to her. and when he answered, she was crying, her voice breaking as she asked him what he had done, why he had gone behind her back, how he could have betrayed her like this. Carmichael had already filed preliminary paperwork, had already sent notification to the Brennan family attorneys, and somehow, through channels Ethan didn't understand, the news had reached his Uncle David, who had called his mother in a rage, demanding to know what she thought she was doing, accusing her of trying to steal money from her own family, threatening to cut her off entirely if she pursued this insanity. Ethan tried to explain, tried to tell her he had done it for her, for justice, for the principle of the thing. But his words sounded hollow even to his own ears, and his mother cut him off with a question that silenced him completely. She asked him whose pain this was, whose trauma, whose decision, and she asked him who he thought he was helping. Really, because from where she stood it looked like he was helping himself feel righteous and powerful at the expense of her peace, her privacy, her right to choose how her own story would unfold. Then she told him not to call her again until he had undone what he had done, until he had withdrawn the case and apologized to everyone he had hurt, and she hung up before he could respond, leaving him alone on the darkening highway with the full weight of his mistake pressing down on him like a physical thing, like something he would carry forever. The fallout came swiftly and brutally, like a storm that had been building on the horizon finally making landfall. And within 48 hours of Carmichael filing the preliminary papers, Ethan's entire world had shifted into a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The Brennan family lawyers, a team from one of the most prestigious firms in the state, responded with a motion to dismiss that was less a legal document and more a declaration of war. And attached to their filing was a counterclaim accusing Ethan of fraud, of attempting to extort money from a prominent family using forged documents and false claims about paternity that could not be substantiated without DNA evidence that no longer existed since Harold Brennan had been cremated a decade ago. Carmichael called him on Wednesday morning, his voice tight with a tension that hadn't been there during their first meeting, and he explained that the Brennans were playing hardball, that they were threatening to pursue criminal charges if the case wasn't withdrawn immediately, that they had private investigators already digging into Ethan's background and his mother's history looking for anything they could use to discredit the claim. The lawyer said he was still confident they could win, that the documents were legitimate and compelling, but his tone suggested otherwise, suggested that he was starting to understand the full scope of what they were up against, the machinery of wealth and influence that could crush people like them without breaking stride. Ethan tried calling his mother again, but she wouldn't answer, and when he drove to her house that evening, he found her car in the driveway, but the lights off and the curtains drawn, and no matter how long he knocked on the door, she wouldn't come out, wouldn't speak to him, and eventually a neighbor came out and asked him to leave, said that Sarah had been through enough and didn't need her son harassing her on her own doorstep. The shame Ethan felt in that moment was physical, a hot burning sensation that started in his chest and spread through his whole body, and he walked back to his car with his head down, unable to meet the neighbor's judgmental gaze, unable to defend himself because everything she implied was true. His Uncle David called him that night, and the conversation was short and venomous, David's voice shaking with rage as he told Ethan that he had destroyed the family, that he had dragged their mother's memory through the mud for nothing but greed, that Sarah had always been troubled, and now Ethan had given her delusions of grandeur that would ruin whatever stability she had managed to maintain. David said that if Ethan didn't drop the case immediately, he would make sure that everyone in town knew what kind of person Ethan really was, that he would call the school board and make sure they understood that one of their teachers was pursuing a frivolous lawsuit against a respected family, that he would do whatever it took to protect the family name from this disgrace. The threat about the school board hit Ethan harder than he expected, made him realize that this wasn't just about him and his mother anymore, that the consequences were spreading outward like ripples from a stone thrown into still water, that his job and his reputation and his entire life could be destroyed by his decision to pursue justice in the most aggressive way possible. He lay awake that night thinking about his students, about the kids who trusted him and looked up to him, and he wondered what they would think if their parents started whispering that Mr. Mitchell was a gold digger who tried to steal money from a wealthy family who had abandoned all sense of propriety and dignity in pursuit of a payout. On Thursday, Carmichael called again, and this time his voice was different, careful and measured in a way that made Ethan's stomach clench with dread. The lawyer said he had received communication from the Brennan attorneys that changed things, that they had uncovered information about the adoption that complicated the case significantly, and he needed Ethan to come to his office immediately to discuss strategy. Ethan drove downtown in a fog of anxiety, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white, and when he arrived at Carmichael's office, he found the lawyer sitting behind his desk with a stack of papers in front of him and an expression that looked almost apologetic. The Brennan lawyers had done their homework, had accessed sealed adoption records through channels that probably weren't entirely legal but were certainly effective, and they had discovered that the adoption of Sarah had been handled not by a licensed agency but by a private attorney who specialized in what were euphemistically called grey market adoptions, arrangements where wealthy men paid to have inconvenient pregnancies resolved quietly and completely. The attorney, a man named Gerald Hawthorne, had been disbarred in 1972 for falsifying documents in multiple cases, and according to the records the Brennan team had uncovered, the adoption papers that showed Harold Brennan as the father might have been fabricated, might have been part of Hawthorne's scheme to extract money from wealthy clients by creating elaborate fictions about paternity and responsibility. Carmichael explained that this didn't necessarily mean Harold wasn't Sarah's father, but it did mean that the documents Ethan had found in his grandmother's safe deposit box couldn't be trusted as proof, that they might be nothing more than expensive lies told by a corrupt lawyer to a grieving couple who wanted a child and were willing to believe whatever story made them feel like they were doing something noble. The lawyer said they could still pursue the case, could try to find other evidence, could attempt to locate Elizabeth Cartwright or track down medical records from the hospital where Sarah was born, but his tone made it clear he thought the chances of success had dropped dramatically, that they were now fighting not just the Brennan family's wealth, but also the murky history of an adoption system that had been designed specifically to hide truths rather than preserve them. Ethan felt the ground shifting beneath him again, felt the certainty that had driven him to take action, crumbling into doubt and confusion, and he asked Carmichael what he recommended, whether they should continue or withdraw. The lawyer was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the desk, and then he said something that made Ethan's blood run cold. He said that in his experience, cases like this were rarely about the truth and almost always about leverage, about who could afford to keep fighting and who would break first, and that the Brennans had made it clear they were willing to spend whatever it took to make this go away, which meant they were either absolutely certain Harold wasn't Sarah's father, or they were terrified that he might be and were trying to bury the possibility before it could be proven. The lawyer suggested a different strategy, a quieter approach, and he said that if Ethan could find Elizabeth Cartwright, if he could get her to agree to tell her story, they might be able to pressure the Brennan family into a settlement without ever going to trial, could use the threat of publicity rather than legal proof to extract some kind of acknowledgement or compensation. Carmichael said he had a private investigator on retainer who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found, and that for a fee they could start searching for Elizabeth, could try to piece together what had happened 60 years ago when a young woman had given up her baby and disappeared into whatever life came after. Ethan left the office with his head spinning, with the realization that he had started something he had no idea how to finish, and he drove aimlessly through the city for hours, watching the sun set and the streetlights come on and the ordinary evening routines of ordinary people unfold through the windows of restaurants and shops. He thought about his mother, isolated in her dark house, refusing to answer his calls, probably terrified of what was coming next, and he thought about his grandmother, about whether she had known the adoption papers might be fraudulent, whether she had suspected Gerald Hawthorne was a con artist, whether the whole sad story she had written in her letter was was based on nothing more than elaborate fiction. That weekend, unable to bear the silence from his mother and unable to stop himself from searching for answers, Ethan hired Carmichael's private investigator, a woman named Louise Chen, who had a reputation for being both discreet and relentless. Louise came to his apartment on Saturday morning and listened to the whole story, taking notes in a small leather notebook. And when he finished, she asked him a question that no one else had thought to raise. She asked him why his grandmother had waited until after her death to reveal this information, why she had never told Sarah while she was alive, why she had put the burden of discovery on her grandson rather than dealing with it herself. Ethan didn't have an answer, could only shake his head and admit that he had been so focused on the injustice of what had been done that he hadn't stopped to think about the peculiarity of how it had been revealed. And Louise nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. She said that in her experience, when people delivered bombshells from beyond the grave, it was often because they knew their revelations wouldn't hold up to scrutiny, knew that once they were dead, no one could question their motives or their certainty, and that sometimes deathbed confessions were less about truth and more about assuaging guilt by passing it on to someone else. The thought that his grandmother might have been wrong, or worse, might have been manipulating him from beyond death, was almost too painful to contemplate. But Louise said it gently, without judgment, and she told him that whatever the truth was, she would help him find it. She said she would start by looking for Elizabeth Cartwright, would search birth records and marriage licenses and obituaries, would try to track down anyone who might have known her in 1965, and that if Elizabeth was still alive, they would find her, and if she was dead, they would at least find out what happened to her and whether her story matched the one Gerald Hawthorne had sold to Robert and Margaret Mitchell all those years ago. Louise left with a retainer check and a promise to call as soon as she had anything, and Ethan spent the rest of the weekend in his apartment, unable to focus on anything, unable to eat or sleep or do any of the normal things that usually structured his days. On Sunday evening, he wrote a long email to his mother, not expecting her to respond, but needing to say the things he couldn't say to her face. And he apologized for everything, for pushing when he should have listened, for making her trauma about his own need to fix things, for starting a war she had never wanted to fight. He told her that he loved her, that nothing he discovered or failed to discover would ever change that, and that if she wanted him to drop the case entirely and walk away from all of it, he would, even though it would mean admitting defeat and possibly facing consequences from the Brennan lawyers who were already sharpening their knives. She didn't respond to the email, but on Monday morning he found a text message from her, just 3 words that somehow contained more weight than anything else she had said to him since this started. She wrote, "Find the truth and nothing else, no explanation or elaboration." But Ethan understood what she meant, understood that she was giving him permission to continue, but only if he was genuinely searching for truth rather than vengeance, only if he was willing to accept whatever answer emerged, even if it wasn't the one he wanted. Louise called him on Tuesday with her first update, and she said that she had found a marriage license for an Elizabeth Cartwright who had married a man named Joseph Reeves in 1967, 2 years after giving birth, and that there was a property record showing Elizabeth and Joseph had owned a small house in a town about 100 miles away until 1989, when the property had been sold. Louise said she was still tracking down more recent information, but it appeared that Elizabeth might have lived a fairly ordinary life after giving up her baby, might have gotten married and settled down and tried to forget whatever had happened with Harold Brennan. The investigator also said she had found something interesting in her research into Gerald Hawthorne, the disbarred attorney who had handled the adoption, and she sent Ethan a scanned document from a 1973 court case where Hawthorne had been accused of creating false paternity claims to extract money from wealthy men who feared scandals. In that case, a businessman had paid Hawthorne $30,000 to arrange an adoption and ensure silence, only to discover years later that the woman claiming he had fathered her child had actually been paid by Hawthorne to lie that the baby had belonged to someone else entirely, and that the whole elaborate story had been a con designed to exploit a man's fear of exposure and his willingness to pay for discretion. Ethan read through the court documents with a sinking feeling, with the horrible realization that his grandmother's entire story might have been built on the lies of a con artist, that Harold Brennan might have been just another mark, that Sarah's true origins might be completely unknown and unknowable. He thought about all the pain he had caused, all the relationships he had damaged, all the certainty he had brought to a situation that was anything but certain, and he felt a shame so profound it was almost paralyzing. But Louise told him not to give up yet, told him that court cases weren't the whole story, that just because Hawthorne had run cons didn't mean every adoption he facilitated was fraudulent, and that they needed to find Elizabeth Cartwright and hear her version of events before they could know anything for sure. She said she was close to locating Elizabeth, that the trail was getting warmer, and that with a little more time and a little more money, she was confident she could arrange a meeting. Ethan authorized the additional expense, even though his savings were dwindling, even though he wasn't sure anymore what he was paying to discover, and he waited through the rest of that week in a state of suspended anxiety, going through the motions of teaching his classes, but unable to focus on lesson plans or student questions, his mind always circling back to the central mystery that had consumed his life, the question of who his mother really was and whether the answer would bring healing, or only more pain. Louise called on Friday afternoon with the news that would change everything, her voice carefully neutral in the way people sound when they're trying to prepare you for something difficult. And she told Ethan that she had found Elizabeth Cartwright, or rather Elizabeth Reeves as she had been known for the past 58 years, and that the woman was alive and living in a nursing home in a town called Riverside Heights, about 90 miles north. Louise said she had made contact through the nursing home staff, had explained in vague terms that there was a family matter that needed clarification, and that Elizabeth had agreed to meet with Ethan on Sunday afternoon if he was willing to make the drive. Ethan's hands were shaking as he wrote down the address, as he thanked Louise for her work, as he ended the call and sat staring at his phone, trying to process the fact that in less than 48 hours he would be face to face with the woman who might be his grandmother, the woman whose choices 60 years ago had set all of this in motion. He thought about calling his mother, about asking if she wanted to come with him, but he remembered her text message, "Find the truth," and he understood that she was leaving this to him, that she couldn't bear to be present for whatever revelation was coming, that she needed him to be her eyes and ears and shield against whatever Elizabeth might say. He spent Saturday in a state of restless anxiety, cleaning his apartment obsessively, going for long walks that did nothing to calm his racing thoughts, trying to prepare himself for a conversation he couldn't possibly prepare for. That night, he lay awake rehearsing questions, imagining scenarios, wondering if Elizabeth would be angry at being found, if she would refuse to talk, if she would confirm or deny the story Gerald Hawthorne had told his grandparents, if she would even remember Harold Brennan after all these years. Sunday morning came grey and overcast, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain, and Ethan drove north through landscapes that gradually shifted from suburban sprawl to rural farmland, small towns with main streets lined by empty storefronts and churches with fading white paint. Riverside Heights turned out to be one of these towns, population maybe 3,000, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and strangers were noticed immediately. And the nursing home was a low brick building on the edge of town, surrounded by oak trees that had probably been planted when the place was built sometime in the 1970s. The receptionist was expecting him, a young woman with kind eyes, who led him down a hallway that smelled of disinfectant and overcooked vegetables, and and she stopped at a door marked with the number 14 and knocked softly before opening it. The room was small but clean, a single bed with a blue quilt, a dresser with photographs in frames, a window looking out onto a garden where a bird feeder hung from a metal pole, and sitting in a chair by that window was a woman so small and frail she looked like she might blow away if the breeze picked up. Elizabeth Reeves was 90 years old, her hair white as snow and her face mapped with wrinkles that told stories of decades lived. And when she turned to look at Ethan, her eyes were still sharp, still clear, still capable of seeing right through whatever defenses he might try to erect. The receptionist introduced him and then left, closing the door softly behind her, and Ethan stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, suddenly unsure how to begin, how to ask this elderly woman about the most painful moment of her youth without being cruel. But Elizabeth spoke first, her voice surprisingly strong, and she told him to sit down, told him she'd been expecting someone to come eventually, told him that secrets had a way of surfacing no matter how deeply you buried them. Ethan sat in the chair opposite her, and he tried to explain why he was there, tried to tell the story of his mother and his grandmother's letter and the documents that suggested Harold Brennan had paid for an adoption. But Elizabeth raised a thin hand and stopped him, and she said she knew why he had come, that Louise had already explained enough, and that if he wanted to know the truth, she would tell it to him, but only if he promised to understand that the past was complicated and that people did what they thought they had to do to survive, Ethan promised, and Elizabeth began to speak, her words coming slowly at first and then faster, like a dam breaking after years of holding back a flood, and she told him a story that was both simpler and more heartbreaking than anything he had imagined. She said that in 1964, she had been 22 years old, working as a secretary at a real estate company downtown, and that Harold Brennan had been her boss, married with 3 young sons but charming and attentive in a way that had made her feel special, chosen, important. She said the affair had lasted 6 months, secret meetings in hotels on the edge of town, promises that he would leave his wife, dreams of a future that had evaporated the moment she told him she was pregnant. Harold had been furious, she said, had accused her of trying to trap him, had told her that his family and his reputation were more important than any child, and he had given her 2 choices, have an abortion or give the baby up for adoption. And either way, he would pay for everything and make sure she never had to work again. But if she refused, if she tried to keep the baby or tell anyone who the father was, he would destroy her, would make sure she never worked in this town again, would use every connection he had to turn her into a pariah. Elizabeth said she had been terrified, had been completely alone, with no family support and no resources, and after weeks of agonizing deliberation, she had agreed to the adoption, had carried the baby to term in a home for unwed mothers on the other side of the state, had given birth to a daughter in the spring of 1965, and held her for exactly 10 minutes before a nurse took her away forever. Tears were streaming down Elizabeth's weathered cheeks as she spoke, and Ethan felt his own eyes burning, felt the weight of this woman's grief pressing against his chest like something physical, and she told him that Gerald Hawthorne had handled everything, had arranged the adoption through a couple named Mitchell who wanted a daughter, had made sure all the papers were signed and sealed, had given her an envelope with $5,000 in cash, and told her never to contact Harold again, never to tell anyone what had happened, never to try to find the child she had given away. She said she had taken the money and moved to Riverside Heights, had met Joseph a year later and married him, and tried to build a life that didn't include the daughter-shaped hole in her heart, but that she had thought about that baby every single day for 60 years, had wondered what she looked like, what her life was like, whether she was happy, whether she ever thought about the mother who had given her away. Ethan asked the question that had brought him here, asked if she was certain that Harold Brennan was the father, if there was any possibility that the documents Hawthorne had created were false, and Elizabeth looked at him with an expression that was both pitying and fierce. She said that Harold was absolutely the father, that there had been no one else, that she had been a virgin when she met him and faithful during their affair, and that whatever crimes Gerald Hawthorne had committed in other cases, the paternity claim in this situation was completely accurate. She said Harold had known it too, had never questioned it, had simply wanted it erased because acknowledging it would have complicated his carefully constructed life. Then Elizabeth asked Ethan a question that stopped his breath, asked him if the daughter was still alive, if she had lived a good life, if the Mitchells had been kind to her. And Ethan found himself nodding, found himself telling this woman about his mother, about Sarah, who was quiet and gentle, and who had always seemed to carry a sadness she couldn't name, who had raised Ethan alone after his father died, who had never asked for anything, who had spent her whole life trying to belong to a family that had kept the truth of her origins locked away. He told Elizabeth that Sarah had been loved, that Margaret and Robert had been good parents in their way, but that she had always felt different, had always sensed something was missing, and that learning the truth had broken something in her that might never heal. Elizabeth closed her eyes, and fresh tears slipped down her face, and she said that she had hoped giving the baby to a good family would mean her daughter wouldn't have to carry the same pain, wouldn't have to know what it felt like to be unwanted by the people who should have wanted you most, but that she saw now the pain had simply taken a different form, had manifested as a lifetime of not quite belonging, of sensing you were other without understanding why. She said she had made a terrible mistake all those years ago, had let Harold bully her into giving up her child, had chosen her own survival over her daughter's right to know where she came from, and that if she could go back she would make different choices, would find a way to keep the baby, even if it meant being poor and disgraced, because at least then her daughter would have known she was wanted, would have known her mother had fought for her. Ethan asked if she would be willing to meet Sarah, to tell her directly what she had just told him, to give his mother the gift of knowing that she hadn't been abandoned because she was deficient, but because her biological mother had been trapped and terrified and operating under impossible constraints. Elizabeth was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the bird feeder where sparrows were fighting over seeds, and then she said yes. She would meet Sarah if Sarah wanted to meet her, but that Ethan needed to understand something important first. She told him that the Brennan family would never acknowledge Sarah, would never give her a share of the inheritance, would never admit that Harold had fathered a child outside his marriage, because doing so would tarnish the reputation they had spent decades building, would open them up to other claims from other women Harold might have wronged, would suggest that their wealth was built not just on business acumen, but on the exploitation and erasure of inconvenient people. Elizabeth said she had followed the Brennan family over the years, had read about them in the papers, and she knew they were the kind of people who would spend millions in legal fees to avoid paying out thousands in settlements, who would destroy anyone who threatened their narrative, who would choose power over truth every single time. She told Ethan that if he pursued this legally, if he tried to force the Brennans to acknowledge Sarah, he would be fighting a war he couldn't win, and that the only people who would suffer would be him and his mother, because the Brennans had resources and connections and a willingness to be ruthless that ordinary people couldn't match. But she also said that sometimes the truth was enough, that sometimes knowing where you came from and understanding that you were wanted, even if the circumstances made keeping you impossible, could be a kind of justice that didn't require courts or money or public acknowledgement. Elizabeth reached out and took Ethan's hand, her fingers cold and fragile as bird bones, and she told him to tell Sarah that her mother was sorry, that her mother had loved her from the moment she knew she existed, that her mother had carried the weight of losing her every day of her life, and that if Sarah could find it in her heart to forgive an old woman's cowardice, Elizabeth would like to spend whatever time she had left trying to know the daughter she had given away 60 years ago. Ethan drove home through the gathering dusk with Elizabeth's words echoing in his mind, with the weight of her grief and her longing pressing against his chest. And when he reached his apartment, he didn't go inside, but instead sat in his car and called his mother. And this time she answered on the third ring, her voice hoarse as if she had been crying or perhaps simply hadn't spoken to anyone in days. He told her everything. Told her about Elizabeth and the nursing home and the story of a young woman trapped by circumstance and fear. Told her about Harold Brennan and the affair and the choices that had been made before she was even born. And he told her that her biological mother was alive and wanted to meet her, wanted to say the things she should have been able to say 60 years ago, but hadn't had the courage or the freedom to speak. His mother was silent for so long that Ethan thought she had hung up, but then he heard her breathing, ragged and unsteady, and she asked him in a whisper if Elizabeth had really wanted her, if the adoption had truly been forced rather than chosen, because that question had been living in her heart since the moment she read his grandmother's letter, the terrible possibility that she had been unwanted from the very beginning, that she had been a burden her biological mother had been relieved to shed. Ethan told her what Elizabeth had said, told her about the tears and the decades of grief and the daughter-shaped hole that had never healed. And he heard his mother break down completely, heard her sob in a way he had never heard before, a sound that was equal parts pain and relief, the release of a lifetime of wondering and doubting and carrying a wound she had never been able to name. They talked for 2 hours that night, mother and son, finding their way back to each other through the wreckage of the choices Ethan had made. And his mother told him she forgave him, told him she understood that he had been trying to help even if his methods had been wrong, and she asked him to call Carmichael and withdraw the lawsuit, to tell the lawyer that they were done fighting, that whatever the Brennans owed her wasn't worth the cost of pursuing it. Ethan promised he would, and the next morning he went to Carmichael's office and signed the papers that ended the legal case before it had really begun, and the lawyer looked almost relieved, as if he had known all along that this was a battle they were never meant to win. The Brennan family attorneys sent a tersely worded letter acknowledging the withdrawal and warning that any future attempts to contact the family or make claims against the estate would be met with immediate legal action. And Ethan filed the letter away and tried not to think about the 3 brothers living in their mansions, protected by their ignorance, never having to reckon with what their father had done or who their father had been beneath the carefully constructed public image. There was an injustice in that, a bitter unfairness that would never be resolved, but Ethan was learning that not every wrong could be righted, that sometimes the best you could do was acknowledge the harm and try to heal the wounds it left behind. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday morning when spring was finally pushing through the last remnants of winter and the air smelled of rain and growing things, Ethan drove his mother to Riverside Heights, and they made the journey mostly in silence, both of them nervous and uncertain about what they would find, both of them carrying hopes they were afraid to speak aloud. His mother had dressed carefully that morning, wearing a blue dress that brought out her eyes, and Ethan noticed that she had put on makeup for the first time in weeks, had tried to look her best for this meeting with the woman who had given her life and then given her away. Elizabeth was waiting in the common room when they arrived, sitting in the same chair by the window, and when she saw Sarah walk through the door, her hand flew to her mouth and she made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Ethan watched as his mother crossed the room slowly, as these 2 women who shared blood and bone and 60 years of separation finally stood face to face, and he saw his mother's composure crack, saw her start to cry, and then Elizabeth was crying too, and they reached for each other tentatively at first, and then desperately, holding on as if they could make up for all the lost years through the simple act of touch. Ethan left them alone after a few minutes, stepped out into the hallway to give them privacy, and he stood by a window overlooking the garden and thought about his grandmother Margaret, about the letter she had written and the burden she had passed to him, and he realized that maybe she had known exactly what she was doing, had understood that the truth needed to come out, but that it needed to come out gently, needed to be discovered rather than declared, needed to bring healing rather than just vindication. She had given him the key not to unlock a fortune, but to unlock a story, to find the missing pieces that would help his mother understand herself. And in that sense, her final gift had been exactly what was needed, even if it had taken him a painful detour to understand it. When he returned to the common room an hour later, he found his mother and Elizabeth sitting close together, holding hands, their faces still wet with tears, but also transformed by something that looked like peace, like the beginning of acceptance. Elizabeth was telling Sarah about her life, about Joseph and the 40 years they had spent together before his death, about the teaching career she had built and the students she had influenced, about the garden she had kept and the books she had read, and all the ordinary beautiful moments that had made up a life lived in the shadow of one terrible choice. And Sarah was listening with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing every word, was building a picture of this woman who was her mother, was trying to understand the full scope of a person rather than reducing her to a single decision made under duress. They made plans to see each other again, to start building a relationship that would necessarily be brief, given Elizabeth's age, but could still be meaningful, could still provide the connection they had both been missing. And when Ethan and his mother finally left the nursing home and walked to the car, Sarah turned to him and thanked him, told him that despite everything that had gone wrong, despite all the pain and conflict his actions had caused, he had ultimately given her something she had needed her whole life without knowing it. The knowledge that she had come from love, even if the circumstances had twisted that love into separation. The drive home was different from the drive there, lighter somehow, and Sarah talked about Elizabeth, about the things they had discussed, about the plans they had made to meet again the following week. And Ethan listened and felt the tightness in his chest that had been there for months, finally beginning to ease. His mother said she was going to tell David and Thomas the truth about her adoption, was going to be honest with them about who she was and where she came from, but that she wasn't going to pursue any claim against the Brennan estate, wasn't going to force a confrontation that would only bring more pain. She said she had what she needed now, the knowledge of her origins and a relationship with the woman who had given her life, and that everything else was just noise, just the world's obsession with money and status that had nothing to do with the things that actually mattered. Ethan thought about the documents still sitting in his apartment, the proof of Harold Brennan's paternity and the evidence of his callousness, and he decided that he would keep them safe but would never use them, would preserve the truth without weaponizing it, would let them stand as a testament to what had happened without forcing anyone to publicly acknowledge it. Some battles weren't meant to be won, some injustices weren't meant to be corrected through courts and confrontations, and sometimes the quiet act of knowing was enough. The simple recognition that what happened was wrong, even if the world would never officially declare it so. In the weeks that followed, Sarah visited Elizabeth every Saturday, and gradually the old woman's stories filled in the blanks of Sarah's history, gave her a sense of where she came from that she had been missing her entire life. Elizabeth grew weaker as spring turned to summer, her body finally surrendering to the weight of 9 decades, but she did so peacefully, surrounded by photographs Sarah had brought of her life, pictures of Ethan as a baby, pictures of the house where she had grown up, pictures that proved she had been loved and had built something meaningful even if the beginning had been fractured. When Elizabeth died in early July, Sarah was holding her hand, and she told Ethan afterward that her mother's last words had been thank you, and that she had squeezed Sarah's fingers with a strength that seemed impossible for someone so frail, as if she was pouring everything she had left into that final gesture of connection. They buried Elizabeth in the cemetery in Riverside Heights, and Sarah arranged for a headstone that listed her as a beloved mother, teacher, and friend. And Ethan stood beside his mother at the graveside and thought about inheritance, about the things we pass down and the things we carry, about the way stories can be buried for decades and still rise to the surface when the time is right. The Brennan brothers never knew they had a sister, never had to reckon with their father's choices, never had to share the wealth that had been built partially on the erasure of an inconvenient child, and there was an injustice in that would never be resolved. But standing in that cemetery with his mother, watching her say goodbye to the woman who had given her life, Ethan understood that some kinds of justice couldn't be measured in money or public acknowledgement, that sometimes healing came not from winning, but from knowing, from connecting, from being seen and recognized by the one person whose validation mattered most. The inheritance that mattered hadn't been the one locked in a safe deposit box or hidden in legal documents, but rather the inheritance of truth, of story, of understanding where you came from and who wanted you, even when the world made it impossible for them to keep you. And that inheritance, once claimed, could never be taken away by lawyers or powerful families, or the machinery of wealth that tried to erase inconvenient truths. Before you go, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story, because each week a new hidden truth rises to the surface, and I want you with me for every twist.